Welcome everyone to FME Flow Fundamentals for Administrators. This is the first part in a two-part series that we're hosting. Today we'll be covering setup and configuration FAQs. So in preparation for this webinar, we actually had a whole team of SAFERs get together and go through potential FAQs to address. And so we have some curated questions today that we feel would be most relevant and valuable to all of you. And of course, as we're going through, if there's anything else that comes to your mind beyond what we are discussing today, please do drop that in the questions tab. Today, I am joined by our lovely team of 3 panelists, and I will pass things over to Chris to introduce himself.
Yeah, so my name's Chris. I lead the customer solutions team here at SAFE. I'll hand it over to Sinai so we can be short and sweet with this.
Hi everyone, my name is Sinai. I am a technical support specialist for the FME Flow product.
And finally, my name is Merlin George. I work with Sinai in the technical support team for FME Flow.
Fantastic. And we also have Steve joining us on the back end here this morning to support with questions. Steve, would you like to pop on for a minute?
Yeah, good morning, everyone, and afternoon and evening. Thanks for joining us. And looking forward to answering your questions, and hopefully I do a good job of that.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. So as we just mentioned, the questions tab, you can find that in the bottom right. Keep letting us know where you're joining us from in the chat there. We have 2 polls coming up, so keep an eye on that polls tab. And then if you do have any audio issues or video issues during the webinar, click that help button on the bottom left for 4 simple steps to take. And then the react button on the bottom middle. We like to see any reactions you might have during the webinar, so feel free to use that as well. Okay, at this point, I will prompt our presenters to turn off their webcams so we can save on some bandwidth throughout the remainder here. And with that, I will take us through our agenda here. So without reading all of these out, we do have 9 different questions that we will be addressing here today. Starting off with what is FME at the very most basic level there, and then we'll be working our way through these other 8 questions that we've picked out, that we've seen frequently asked, and that we feel would bring the most value to you all today. And then at the end, we do also hope to have a few minutes remaining for some questions to address live. All right, and with that, I will pass things over to Chris.
All right, thank you, Elizabeth. Yeah, so as we've already mentioned in this very brief intro, we're obviously going to be focusing today on FME Flow and really helping you set up your FME Flow deployment so you're going to be ready for a smooth rollout and ready to start your FME journey effectively. So we're going to start things off with our very first poll to start the day, and we're just curious, what is your top concern when configuring FME Flow? So you can see just on the bottom right-hand side, the poll has officially launched at this point. And so we'll just wait for some answers to come in through here. And it looks like authentication and security is off to a very early lead.
Yeah, and I ended up making it so that you can choose your top 1 to 2 in case more than one resonates with you.
Okay, perfect.
And it looks like 2 are definitely have taken the cake there. Authentication and security. I feel like that comes as no surprise. Security is such a top concern.
Topic, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that's awesome. It looks like the poll results are slowing down, so I think we can go ahead and move on to the next section here. So yeah, thank you so much for your input there. So whether you're brand new to FME Flow or you've been with it for a while, it's good to just reiterate that FME Flow offers streamlined solutions, and this is really the automation platform of the FME platform. So here, what we're going to be walking through, of course, is everything you need to know for your install and configuration. So just some common considerations that we get asked, and figured we put them all into one webinar. To start things off, we're going to really lead in with what is FME. And so I'll just take us through what the FME platform comprises of. So the FME Enterprise Integration Platform is the only all data enterprise integration platform. And today, of course, we're going to be focusing on the right-hand side of the screen, but just in case you are new to FME, it does consist of two technologies. First is FME Form, and that is the authoring environment where workspaces are built. So you build your workspaces with the readers, transformers, and writers, and that's where you define your business logic for all of your workflows. Once you're satisfied with those, you go ahead and publish them to FME Flow or FME Flow Hosted. And that is the deployment environment where you can set up automations, workspace apps, streams for real-time processing, or even execute these jobs programmatically using the REST API. And so we have this broken into a couple of different sections. Really, it's two main ones. We have event-driven and real-time. So on the event-driven side, you have your FME Flow apps, and that's where you can have users submit files, have the results of a workspace streamed back, or the results downloaded as available as a downloadable zip file. They can be configured as automations in a polling service. So whether you're working with FTP sites, S3 network directories to watch for any file changes, that's where you can have FME go out and check every defined interval and effectively poll those services to see when changes have occurred, and that can trigger a process or an automation. And then again, you can also configure these to run as a webhook or from the REST API. On the real-time side of things, this is where you can get a little bit more fancy with IoT based workspaces. So you can run a job continuously effectively if you're working with any sensor data, or you can have push services start off your automations as well. They're called triggers in FME Flow automations, but this can be something like a webhook being received or a topic being notified. All of these things can start off your FME Flow automations. So FME Flow automations, again, are your event-driven workflows. These essentially eliminate manual intervention and allow you to string together multiple workspaces to build out sophisticated processes or very basic ones if you only have a basic need for data transformation or application integration. They consist of three main components. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see that green object. That's the trigger, so that's what's going to start the automation. You have the action, which is the orange object in the canvas, and you can string multiple of these together. Again, they can run in parallel or in sequence, depending on how many engines you have available. And those blue objects are your external actions, and they kind of mimic what the triggers have for essentially sending HTTP requests, sending an email, or uploading files to FTP sites. So lots of options there. Workspace apps are basically a no-code web interface or a web form that allows your FME Flow instance to be accessible to even more of your organization or even to the general public. So this is a great way to put FME in the hands of many, as it doesn't require people to have the knowledge of how to build an FME form workspace. It simply requires them to fill out a couple of parameters, click a run button, and either get the results or submit the job. So it's a very easy way to make FME more accessible. A couple more things to note with what is FME. FME Flow specifically is unlimited managed users. So this is where, again, it really opens up to your organization because it's licensed per engine rather than per user. So this is a great way, again, to put FME in the hands of many. You have, of course, a flexible engine management. So we're going to go through this in more detail in a couple more slides, but you can deploy your engines anywhere. We'll get into the differences of the different types of engines, but effectively you can make sure it runs as close to your data as possible to prevent any latency. And we have advanced engine management as well. So you can configure things like queues, job routing, active periods, and engine assignments. And again, we'll go through those in more detail here. So just some justification for, again, why you would want to use FME Flow. This is something that the city of Naperville has implemented for integrating their FME with CityWorks to automate their service requests and work orders. And using FME Flow, they've actually saved 3 staff members all this time from what we're previously doing as manual repetitive tasks to do other value-added tasks and bring more value to the organization. In total, this has automated over 3,300 service requests over the course of, I believe it was a year. And obviously that comes with huge amounts of time savings, again, from manual effort. So what we're looking at here is really just a basic overview of where FME flows in the organization. So again, you have FME Form, and that's at that desktop level where you're going to be building these workflows. Once you've published those to FME Flow, we have it broken into 2 different sections here. So you have what's referred to as your author in FME Flow, and this is someone who's either configuring those workspace apps, automations, schedules, or the stream processes. And then there's the admin side as well. So that's going to be someone who's going to be configuring things like SAML or your Active Directory, monitoring the system performance. So this is essentially where FME, those two pieces of FME form gets published up to FME Flow, and that's where you can make it more accessible again to the entire organization. And at this point, we have one more poll before we dive into our next section here. So we're just curious, how familiar are you with FME Flow? And again, you can see the poll in the bottom right-hand side of the Livestorm menu. We've got a good spread here. This is awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, great to see so many new users.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a few experts in the audience today, but beyond that, quite spread out between those who are new, have some experience, and are quite familiar.
Mm-hmm.
Awesome. Thanks everyone for voting there. All right, with that, I will take us to our next FAQ here. So the next one is, what key aspects of the architecture should you understand before installing FME Flow? And I'll pass it over to Sinai to get us started here.
Thanks, Elizabeth. This is a great starting point for administrators, especially new administrators, because once you have the basic understanding of FME Flow architecture, everything else falls into place and starts to make sense. Under the hood, FME Flow is actually a collection of several components, each performing a different function in the platform. So the core is the control room. It's going to orchestrate the rest of the components. The engines are like the worker bees. They're responsible for processing jobs and delivering the results to the core. The database is the blueprint. It stores all your configuration data about FME Flow. So not to be confused with workflow data, this stores things like your administration settings, your database connections, things like that. We recommend using the default Postgres database, especially the one that's shipped with our installer, but SQL Server and Oracle can be used instead if you require. The web application server provides FME Flow's website and API. This is how your users and other clients will interact with FME Flow. And we ship Apache Tomcat, though there is the option for some configuration, custom configuration here as well. And the system share is our centralized file storage for workflow data, like workspaces and uploaded data sets. There's an option to put this on a network drive or close to your engines. There's the option for custom configuration here as well. So altogether, these are what forms the building blocks of FME Flow. And I like to think of it like owning a car. You don't really need to know all of the details under the hood of FME Flow, but you do need to know how to maintain it. And it's the car analogy, how to fill it with gas, change your oil, replace the tires once a year. And the same goes for maintaining FME Flow. Once you get the basics of the architecture, the troubleshooting and maintenance are easier to understand and plan for. So keep these components in mind as we go through the questions today.
Okay, so on to our next question here. What are the different deployment options that folks have available?
Yeah, and I'll just continue on with this idea. Now that we have the architectural components in mind, we can understand how these components can be installed in different ways. This allows customers to tailor their deployment to meet any organizational, environmental, or workflow requirements, as well as things like SLAs. So I'll explain the key differences between the common deployment types. Express installations consist of all the default components installed to a single machine. Given enough resources, Express installations deliver excellent performance with very minimal maintenance. An Express deployment is recommended for all customers who do not have specific requirements like fault tolerance or disaster recovery. And they are also scalable with engines, which we'll get into a bit later. Distributed installations consist of components installed on different machines, so within the same network. So customers may choose this if they plan for fault tolerance in the future, want maximum scalability and flexibility, or maybe they have different administrators that want to maintain each component, like a database admin who wants full access to the FME Flow database. There are other unique workflow requirements that may call for a distributed installation as well. The drawback is just the added complexity. You have more machines to maintain, so administrators must be prepared to maintain multiple environments and also the communication between them. Fault-tolerant installations consist of redundant components installed on different machines. So customers bring their own load balancer to manage the job routing between them. And as this graphic illustrates, if one host goes to offline, the other host can continue to run jobs. This is a requirement for some customers who need that high availability to fulfill their SLAs. But again, it does introduce some additional complexity that you have to account for maintenance and upgrades. So in summary, simple is really better in most cases. So for most customers, we recommend an express installation. However, FME Flow is extremely flexible and can be installed to accommodate many different workflow and environment requirements. If scalability is your primary concern, then you really need to only focus on the FME Flow engines in most cases. Engines can be scaled for all different deployment types, and we'll talk more about engines in the next question. In addition to architectural flexibility, we also can deploy FME Flow to many different types of environments. So you might deploy to your local server, a cloud-hosted server, containerization, or across mixed environments, and these may be Windows or Linux-based. And while I've been in support, I've heard lots of new FME Flow administrators express that they're very pleasantly surprised at how easy it is to deploy and install FME. So I've just finished up this answer with a great quote from Merrick at Visimind that touches on that and sums it up. Okay, on to the next question.
All right, awesome. So our next one here is asking, what are the differences between FME Flow engine types?
All right. So as Sinai just went through with a couple of those examples of how you can deploy with fault tolerance or distributed or express, I'll actually be diving into the specifics of how the engine actually works now. So with a standard engine, this is a fixed license that's purchased per engine and available for the duration of that license period effectively. On the left-hand side of this screenshot, you can see that with this serial number specifically, we have 10 licenses available to us. And a standard engine is something that once deployed is available and essentially just waiting for jobs and start executing them. So this engine is the exact same thing on the Workbench application. So in FME Form, in terms of processing capabilities, it's the exact same engine spread across FME Form and FME Flow. This is just going into where you're actually deploying these now at this point. CPU usage engines are also previously referred to as dynamic engines. These are licensed by CPU time, and it's a credit-based system where you can buy a block of credits, and all these jobs, these are able to deploy as many CPU engines as possible. Obviously, there are some limitations here that you will need specific hardware to support this, but this allows you to spin up a specified number of engines to help churn through specific peaks of data processing requirements that you may have. One way to identify when you would want to use CPU usage engines is, again, just looking at that translation log to see how many CPU usage seconds or minutes are available in each job. Because again, this is where it's going to start to cut down on the number of credits that you'll have available. But this is a great solution for any jobs that, again, have specific peaks in volume or when you don't have a known threshold and it can kind of exceed your queue at a specific time. The way it works is 1 credit is equal to 1 hour of CPU time. So this will be dependent on the jobs you're actually running. Some organizations may not benefit from CPU usage, but if you're an organization that has, say, a need for 10 concurrent requests, but then you have off chances where you could need up to 100 requests at the same time, concurrent requests, that's where CPU usage really comes in, because you can deploy 10 standard engines and have these CPU usage engines standing by to handle those variable loads and peaks in processing requirements. So just looking at the differences of them side by side, we do have some recommended usage again. So with a standard engine, this is again the predictable and consistent workload where you know the number of concurrent requests that you have to have for your organization, whether that's 2, 5, 10. This is how many standard engines you would want to deploy and have available on your instance. Because again, these are always on, they're always waiting for new job submissions, whether that is executed from automations, Flow workspace apps, or even things like stream processing. Again, this is an engine that's always on and is dedicated to that one process if you're using it for stream processing. CPU usage, on the other hand, is best suited for unpredictable workloads. And this is including things like workspace apps, automations, and reducing volumes in job queues. So CPU usage is, again, really good for when you have peaks in data processing requirements. This is when they can automatically turn themselves on, cut down that job queue, and then turn themselves off. So it's a very cost-effective way, instead of deploying in that similar scenario, instead of deploying 100 standard engines, which would cost a lot more, you can deploy your 10 standard engines and have CPU usage kind of handle the rest of the volume as it comes variable throughout the year. This can still be used for stream processing, and it can be a very cost-effective approach for stream processing because, again, it's only being billed by the CPU usage of that job. So even though your job may be running continuously, it might be waiting for messages to come through and actually do any transformations. So it can be a cost-effective approach for CPU usage, but our team can also help you make sure that is an appropriate fit for your organization instead of dedicating a standard engine to it. In terms of where you're actually deploying these engines, this is where it can be deployed obviously on the same machine, or you can also leverage something called the remote engine service. Now, these are available as standard or CPU usage engines and allow you to deploy an engine close to your data to cut down on latency, ingress and egress fees, because you can process the data in the same data warehouses and as where your data is residing. And this is available outside of your network or on accessible endpoints or even in the cloud. So if you have a configuration where you need to be have engines distributed across multiple clouds or outside of your network, remote engines have you covered there. On the flip side, what Sinai just went through with the distributed engine setup, obviously that has to be set up within the same network and as the rest of your FME Flow components. And this requires some bidirectional ports and continuous network trafficking considerations. So again, a little bit more complex to configure. The remote engine service, on the other hand, can operate in multiple networks. Obviously, there will be security considerations along with that, but it is in general an easier installation process. So you do have options with how you want to distribute your engines. And I believe this is the last slide of the section for me on the engine requirements. This is where, again, you do have specific requirements for how these engines actually function in terms of the hardware. Our recommendation is to have one CPU core per engine, and this applies to either standard or CPU usage engines. In terms of the memory requirements for your engines, this is very job dependent. And again, best practice here is to review your job logs. If you do have high memory jobs, you can use something like queues to route this to an engine machine that has more RAM. So you can kind of check your job statistics, see which ones have high memory usage, and intelligently route them to the appropriate engine to make sure you're not going to have throttling or memory issues by having to write out temporary files effectively. So be sure to take advantage of all the features of FME Flow, including things like queues, job routing, and engine assignment. And on the dependencies side of things, any dependencies that use third-party licensing, whether that's ArcGIS for a file geodatabase, any Python libraries that you're using, or even custom transformers, regardless of if you have one engine or 20 engines, wherever you're routing those jobs to, those dependencies need to be available on that same machine as where the engine or where the job is running. So wherever that engine resides, those dependencies need to be available on that engine's machine in order for those jobs to execute successfully.
All right, awesome. Okay, so that brings us to our next question here. What are the basic hardware recommendations? And I'll pass it back over to Sinai for this one.
Thanks, Elizabeth. The hardware required to run FME Flow is actually relatively lightweight. It's the data and processing that's ultimately going to steer that discussion. Therefore, we really recommend taking stock of the type of workflows that you plan to run with FME Flow, as well as any other applications that may be competing for resources on the same system. So the complicated part of this is that this is unique to each customer. So you just have to know your data and processes. So those who are processing Large point clouds with millions of data points will probably have different processing needs and memory needs than someone who's just automating a few daily webhook workflows. So keep this in mind when planning your hardware. However, we can give some baseline recommendations so that you have enough resources to start running basic workflows on FME Flow. These are going to be recommendations that are not necessarily one size fits all, but there's a pretty good chance it'll get you off the ground running. Engines run our jobs, as Chris was kind of explaining in the previous question. So they're doing most of the heavy lifting here for hardware. And we can scale our hardware roughly to the number of engines on the deployment. So the rule of thumb is at least one CPU core for every engine. And we can add an additional 2 or 3 more to run the rest of the FME Flow components and a basic OS. 8 gigabytes is the minimum amount of memory, but more is going to always be better here. Again, we scale this with your data and processes, but we can do 8 to 16 to 32, scaling up with the number of engines there and accommodating some medium-sized work processing and workflows. Disk space, we can start at roughly 100 gigs. FME Flow can probably run with less than this, but I would recommend starting with enough space to grow into. And remember that these are all numbers that can drastically change depending on your workflows and data, but it's easier to start with a few more resources that you think you might need rather than having to add them on later or scale after the fact by adding more resources to machines or adding additional machines. Start with these baseline recommendations, and if you think you may need a little bit more, I would recommend adding a little bit more just so you have enough room to grow into.
All right, for our next question here, can we touch briefly on what considerations should our audience keep in mind with Esri when configuring FME Flow?
Yeah, lots of our customers are using FME Flow with our ArcGIS workflows. So if you're using Esri formats like geodatabases, then your FME Flow needs access to an Esri license, which means installing one or more FME engines on the same machine as an ArcGIS Enterprise or ArcGIS Server license. So keep that in mind when you're doing your deployment planning. And also, before installing FME Flow, refer to our notes on FME and Esri compatibility guide that we have on our knowledge base on our website. We could probably share out the link shortly. And ensure that your working version of ArcGIS will be compatible with the version of FME Flow that you plan to deploy.
Fantastic. Okay, so next I will pass over our question here to Merlin. We'd like to know, what resources do I need to set up SSL?
All right, thanks so much for the question, Elizabeth. With FME Flow, HTTP is the default protocol used to communicate between any client and the FME Flow host, but we can configure HTTPS to ensure that this communication is encrypted so that even if it's intercepted, a third party cannot easily view or use the information. So the encryption type that is used here is the asymmetric encryption or the public key cryptography. This involves a key pair, a public key that is shared openly using a certificate, and the private key that is kept secret and known only to the FME host. So the data that is encrypted with the public key can only be decrypted using the corresponding private key and vice versa. So the data encrypted with the private key can only be decrypted using the corresponding public key. And FME can work with different formats of certificates. So we have the .cer, .crt, .pfx, or .p12 files, and we provide detailed steps on how to work with these formats. However, to ease the process, if you could choose, we recommend using the .pfx file format, where all the entities involved would be bundled up in one file, and it involves fewer configuration steps. So it just makes it a bit easier. I should stress here that it is an advanced configuration, and although we do provide detailed documentation, It requires familiarity with the certificate authority's instructions from your certificate provider and access to the certificates. So there might be multiple certificates that might be needed for this process, the root, multiple intermediary certificates, certificate at the server level. So you really need to have a good understanding of the certificate chain involved here. And of course, in case you are using a web server app that is not shipped with FME, you might need to rely a bit more on the expertise of your own IT team to set up HTTPS on your custom web server. Optionally, if you're using a reverse proxy, that might require additional configuration. We do have some instruction on how to set up HTTPS for popular reverse proxies like the Microsoft IIS and the Nginx. And although it's not recommended for production environments, we also have some instruction on how to use self-signed certificates. Again, you can use them on dev or test or maybe staging environments, but not recommended for production. And then HTTPS with Linux systems. So as of 2022, Linux FME Flow now ships with Nginx as a reverse proxy. And in this setup, you would configure SSL on the Nginx side, not on FME Flow directly. And again, we have instructions on how to set this up. So you've had some guidance. Now, one of our limitations with FME here is that the HTTPS config is not included in the backup and restore process. So when upgrading FME Flow, you'll need to repeat this configuration. And we completely understand this could be a pain point, but we are always trying to make this process better for you. And then another point to note here would be when working with certain transformers that communicate to the endpoint via HTTPS, you will have to keep in mind that you'll have to import SSL certificates in specific locations, whether it's the CA certs or the operating systems certificate store. So if you ever have SSL related errors working with Python, Postgres, Java-based transformers, please reach out to us and we can provide more guidance. And here I have listed all the necessary documentation required to understand this process better. These explain configurations with different file formats and when a reverse proxy is involved. Some of these articles also have video demos that will take you through all the steps. And as with other components of FME Flow, we have a great troubleshooting article for this. And that's about it. That brings us to the end of this question. Over to you, Elizabeth.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Marlon. All right, so our next question here is, what user authentication types does FME support?
Okay, so this is going to be answered by me as well. So thanks, Elizabeth. So FME Flow does have system users and roles that are created by FME after installation, and they provide different levels of access, root, super user access to minimal guest access. All of these system users, except the admin user, are disabled by default, and you can enable, disable, remove, duplicate, or add new system users. We encourage a role-based user access approach instead of a user-based access due to the centralized control and improved scalability. You can use both, but again, role-based is encouraged. So you would provide FME object access and permissions to a role, and then you would assign users to the role. So they would inherit those permissions, and a particular user can be assigned to one or more roles. So that's a little bit about the different approaches we can have. And you might have scenarios where you would like to assign additional permissions to add on to an existing user or role. So you could use a role template, and you can load the role template to the user or the role profile and then assign additional permissions to it. And permissions can be general or specific to the FME item, and we can view and see the summary of the permissions provided to a user or a role per FME object category or per FME object. Optionally, you can enforce a password policy to set password string standards, password expiry, and the number of unique passwords before reuse. So you can also require users to update their passwords at first login, post user creation. So there are a couple of security features here. If you provide an email address for your users and set up the reset password feature, you can allow users to be able to reset their own passwords, so that alleviates that burden off of your IT administrator or FME Flow administrator. Again, one limitation that we currently have is the multi-factor authentication, which is not supported at this time with system users. But if you do plan to integrate a third-party identity provider and configure multi-factor authentication on the provider, if it is supported, that might work. Speaking of third-party identity providers, when you incorporate user accounts from a third party, you can authenticate as users using the third-party credentials. So one of the providers we can use is the Windows Active Directory. So we can also use other LDAP-based directories, but the Windows AD is a popular one. Also, if your Active Directory is SSL configured and you would like to encrypt login request and response, you can use a secure version of LDAP or LDAP-S. Now, there are a few prerequisites. Before creating the connection, you need to make sure to confirm with your domain administrator if your domain controller is a standalone or a load balancer of a clustered domain controller setup. At this time, only a standalone DC is supported. You need to confirm what port number should be used to connect, what connection encryption should be used, SSL or non-SSL, and what's the authentication type that should be selected. You will also need a Windows Service account to use for importing users and groups. This account should have at least read access to the DC. So as you can see, the involvement of your domain administrator is highly recommended when configuring this. Now, importing users and groups. You can import individual users or entire groups from Windows AD. And when you import groups, they become roles in FME Flow. This way, you can use the same groups that exist on AD, and FME Flow maintains a relationship between the users and their associated groups. So even if you import an individual user and then import the user's group as a role, the user is automatically a member of the role in FME Flow. So that helps. We also have an optional field section that can be used to explicitly provide parameters like the realm, KDC host, search bases, alternate DC servers, directory attributes. These are, as I mentioned, optional fields that need to be provided only in the case that the values that are picked up automatically by the system needs to be changed. Otherwise, not required. We can use synchronization here in case you need to update any name changes to the user account made on DC. If there's a break in a relationship between the user and the group on the Active Directory, or a user changes groups, it will also reflect on FME Flow. And you can automate this synchronization in the optional fields, or you can do this manually, however you prefer. And with Windows AD, single sign-on is also an option. And when SSO is enabled, there's no need to type in your credentials to log into Flow Web UI if you are already logged into your workstation with your AD credentials. So you only have to click on a button labeled "Use Windows Credentials" to log in, and the system picks up your username password automatically. This is unlike the non-SSO setup where you would have to manually input your AD username and password. To set up SSO, you would require a service account and some additional service principal name configurations to authenticate and perform necessary operations with AD. And highly recommended to involve your IT administrator, as setting up Windows AD can be an advanced configuration. So another user management option we offer is integration with Azure Microsoft Entra ID. It's also known as Azure AD. It works similar to LDAP, but it authenticates through OAuth 2.0 and the OpenID Connect protocol. The login requires you to click on a sign in with Microsoft button, and you get redirected to the Azure login page, and then you provide the Azure user credentials. In order for the FME Flow to communicate with Azure, you must create and register Flow as an enterprise application on AD, and then provide necessary API read permissions. We do provide documentation on how to set this up, but as always, we recommend that you familiarize yourself with the Azure documentation as well, and also involve the Azure administrator in this process. There is a prerequisite. In most cases, Entra ID requires that the request response URLs for FME Flow should begin with HTTPS. So you should have already configured FME Flow for HTTPS. Similar to LDAP, users and roles can both be explicitly imported into FME. And there are some optional configurations as well, based on your requirements. In case you have a reverse proxy or a load balancer in a high availability flow setup, there will be additional configuration. If the application you created for FME Flow is registered for multiple Azure tenants, meaning you have multiple Azure tenants in your organization, you can allow these secondary tenants to use the app. This will require additional configuration on the Azure side, but we do provide documents and some guidance on how to do this. And then finally, we offer SAML integration, which is based on SAML 2.0 protocol. This can be configured with a variety of identity providers as long as they support SAML 2.0. We have not tested all that are available in the market, but we have suggested steps for a few of the more common providers. HTTPS configuration on FME Flow will be a prerequisite for SAML. And unlike LDAP and the Azure AD authentication previously discussed, users and roles cannot be imported manually or in bulk. So the user is created upon the first successful login to Flow, and they are added to the default system role that is selected in the configuration. And after the initial import, of course, users can be added manually to the right roles if required. Similar to the Azure AD, if you have a reverse proxy or a load balancer in a fault tolerance setup, we will have additional settings. If you would like to customize user attributes as they should be imported into FME, we can use attribute field mapping to map attributes from your SAML provider to the corresponding FME Flow attributes. For the role attribute specifically, once you map it, it overrides the value specified as a default role. Also note that the values of the mapped role must match an already existing role in FME Flow. A large part of the configuration for this mapping is on the SAML side, so you should find documentation from the SAML provider as well. Optionally, if you'd like to ensure that the requests between Flow and SAML provider are signed with the Flow host private key and certificate for security reasons, we can set that up as well. But please do confirm with your identity provider that they support this feature. We also have the provision to either enforce or waive user credential prompting for every time SAML login is initiated, or enforce that the provider and Flow machine must have system clocks that are always synchronized, or in case you would like to allow login even if the clocks are out of sync. And finally, here I have a list of official documentation and articles for all these authentication options with Flow, and any of these would be a great starting point for reference. In case you hit any roadblocks, we have comprehensive troubleshooting guides, and that concludes the answer. Over to you, Elizabeth.
All right, awesome. Thank you, Merlin. Okay, so our, I believe, final question here today is, what kind of maintenance and expertise is required? And so I'll pass this over to Sinai.
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. As you can see, we've covered a lot of topics here today, and we could get into each of these topics probably in more detail if we wanted to. They're all candidates for a webinar of their own, but I want to drive home the point that administering FME Flow really doesn't have to be complicated or difficult. Just like you've seen, we have resources, documentation, and articles for all of the topics that we've talked about today. So I definitely highly suggest checking out our website and checking out some of the links that we've shared today on each of these topics. And then there's just a few general best practices that we can all follow to ensure that we don't run into issues along the way. So at installation time, I would highly recommend documenting all of the customizations and configuration changes that you make to your FME Flow installation. So some of those configurations for user management or security, and you're opening up ports for engines, just make a document, write all that down, and that'll be extremely valuable later on. You'll thank yourself later during upgrades or migrations or troubleshooting. For example, if you have to reach out to support, you can let us know exactly what you've done on that system. And during the upgrade process, review what's changed in the products before doing your upgrade and make sure that all the other applications that FME Flow is interacting with is still compatible. The environment that you're deploying to is compatible. We have a really great new changelog on our website that you can find on our downloads page that actually allows you to compare versions of FME Flow now. So you can put in the version that you're currently at, which one that you're upgrading to, and see what's changed between those two releases. And if you can maintain multiple FME Flow environments, that's a great way to test an upgrade before deploying to production. So if you have a test and a prod, upgrade your test first, run your workflows, make sure everything's working before upgrading your production environment. And of course, performing regular backups, testing that backup file before blowing away production is a really great idea. Lastly, for maintenance, take advantage of the administration tools that we offer to help monitor your FME Flow. So things like cleanup tasks can clear out log files that are old, or we can set up a workflow to archive those log files for future reference. This frees up space, make sure you don't run into memory issues just because maybe we have months worth of log files. We can also set up cleanup tasks to be triggered when you hit certain thresholds on your system as well. So you run out of storage space or get to a certain point, it'll automatically run that cleanup task. So that's a great tool. We have analytics available on FME Flow now, so you can see just how many resources that your engines are consuming and scale your resources according to that. So you can keep an eye on things, see when your big spikes are, when your lulls are, and you can schedule jobs and resources accordingly. We also have system alerts that can send you notifications when things fail or errors occur, all sorts of different things. So definitely leverage those. And then back to our website, this is where we might share important security information or deprecation notices, things like that, that you'll want to keep in mind when you're making changes to your deployment. We're going to dive deeper into all of these kinds of post-installation tips, though, in our next webinar, so part 2 of the administrative series. And I'm sure Elizabeth has a slide coming on that soon. So I'll wrap up this section and we can look forward to the next one. On to you, Elizabeth.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you, Sinai. So now I will take us through some resources here today. And as you've seen throughout the webinar, we have had featured resources slides for quite a few of the topics there to dive further in. So I would highly recommend to download the slide deck itself so that you can have those resources related to each topic that we covered here today. But in general, we would like to share out our free resources that are available to everyone. The FME Academy is guided learning at your fingertips, free of charge. We offer free instructor-led training. So I'll highlight that. And then as well, our webinars. We have lots of upcoming and on demand. So take a look there, give it a search for what topic you're interested in learning more of. Our peak of data integration in Seattle. So that is happening very quickly here, and registration is already open. Abstracts, I will note, are due November 29th, so if you have yet to submit, please do so. In terms of next steps to take here today, I want to give a big shout out and plug for our part 2, and I'll also drop that link in the chat here. So we'll be focusing on management and optimization FAQs. So that will be with Sienna, Matt, and Richard joining me in just a few weeks' time. So highly encourage you to check that out and register if you have yet to do so. And the link is in the chat now as well. We'd love to help you get started. If there is anything that you feel you'd like to go deeper into helping solve any data challenges you may have, please do contact us directly. And our FME Accelerator course is a great place to get started with FME. It's 90 minutes and free of charge. Okay, and our community badge code, I will drop that in the chat as well. If you're a part of our FME community, you can redeem that as a thank you for joining us here today. And if you have yet to check out the community, we encourage you to take a look. It's a great place to network with other users alike and ask any questions. All right, with that, I'll get our presenters to turn on their webcams and we can take a look through the questions here today. We had a lot come in throughout. So yeah, maybe we can select one to get started with. I'm not sure if anyone had a certain question in mind already.
Hello. I was very busy in the questions, so thank you for all your questions.
Yeah.
Not sure if any stand out for me at this moment. There was certainly some questions around restores and backup. There was questions around running the service, the engine service, as impersonating other users, because they're having challenges assigning the domain service account to many databases in their environment. So in those cases there, you're running your engine as a single user, and that's correct. If you're trying to use Windows authentication, for example, at your database ends, then you're going to be running as the same service account each time. So there is some rumblings and noise on that. We have some ideas about how to do some impersonations, or maybe running engines with multiple different service accounts on the same kind of environment, but we haven't really looked into sure. Yeah, we've been asked about a calendar view for our scheduled jobs and automations. I think we have something about that already as an idea.
Yeah, I'd be happy to add that to an enhancement request. It's a great idea.
Yeah, sure is. Yeah, I think another thing that helps you there too is just seeing how busy your environment is, the resource, like the analytics, watching the analytics and see if you are scheduling jobs too many, say overnight, and you need either more engines or you need to spread out the schedules. That can help you too there. All right, let's see if there's any other that pop up. Yeah, we support Docker and Kubernetes already. So that was a question that came up. Do we have Docker containers? And yeah, that's about all I've got, I think. Anybody else see any questions they want to bring up? HTTPS was certainly of interest. We know a lot of our customers we work with when they run into challenges with configuring FME Flow HTTPS. And we're trying to move in directions to improve that for sure, 100%. We know it's a pain point. It's not just a pain point configuring FME Flow HTTPS, it's also a bit of a pain point when you have your own internal databases with their own certificates and you want to secure that communication. So one-way, two-way database comms, that's also another area that we're really trying to make some moves in and help our customers be able to do those things. Yeah. We got a couple more questions coming in.
Victor just asked in the chat if the recording will be sent out. I can take that one. Yes, we will send out the recording and a follow-up email later today, likely, if not tomorrow, as well as we'll send out the slide deck if you didn't get a chance to download it here today.
Perfect. So I just threw up another question that just came in from Alan. Where can we find info on customers who have installed Flow on managed servers like AWS and how that worked? Yeah, it's I'm not sure where you can find that information, but speaking live about it, we have a lot of customers deploying FME Flow on their own servers in AWS, and really, for all intents and purposes, it's the same as installing on your on-premise environment, caveat being networking. So you have to become very good at opening up ports, making sure communications are working between your Flow environment and your other resources that you want to connect to, databases, network shares, web services, whatnot like that. We also have remote engines might be of interest to you, depending on if you have some on-premise databases that you want to run some jobs against, but you're moving things to the cloud, but you still want to maintain some of these maybe more sensitive data type environments on-premise. Then you can look at using what are called remote engines with FME Flow, and that way you can keep that data on-premise processing. Anything else should add to that there, Merlin or Sanai? I think that's... And Azure too, I should mention Google Cloud, Azure, fully supported that way if you want to manage your own servers. There's a good question. I'm sure we have some enhancement requests in place for this, but yeah, when you're in those log pages or troubleshooting problems there, being able to sort some of the columns would be helpful. There is some filtering on there, so I'm not sure if that would help, but yeah, it may be something we could take offline and look into a little bit more for you. File an issue or create an idea too in the community, so we make sure we don't miss it on you.
Yeah, absolutely. There'd be support for that feature. I think in the meantime, you might want to look at our REST API. You'd be able to create some of your own views, maybe even leveraging dashboards in FME Flow, and create some custom views of your jobs, filter out what you don't want to see, and sort however you'd like to. So check out our REST API. We have V3 official right now, and V4 is in progress. So yeah.
And it's probably also worth mentioning too, because the actions page, during a recent reconfiguration of the automation logs, we did separate the log files out. And so now when you have an issue in an automation, you see the error, it takes you to the automations, but you see a whole bunch of logs in there. And so we're doing some work on that to try to make that a better experience, because you're right, you do have to know which log file now to go back into to see what part was having a trouble with. So yeah, by all means, I think that's probably where, was it Samir? Yeah, Samir was asking. So yeah, great point. And I believe there's some work on that.
Yeah, it's coming. I can confirm it's coming in our next release. We'll be able to create a view of a single automation production logs.
Okay.
Yeah.
And we'll caveat it's coming in 24.2, but it's still not out available yet. So can we commit to that? Not really. It might get delayed a little bit, but we're hoping. All right. We got any more questions in there?
Looks like I'm just giving a quick scan, but that we've gotten to them all. And I know we are past the hour here, so it's a good time to mention that if you do have any other questions that come in, we'll leave things running a couple minutes longer just in case. And yeah, be sure to get to as many as we can. And if not, we'll be sure to follow up as well.
One last question then. This one's fairly quickly. So when you publish that workspace with debug mode on, that's preserved and published to the flow. And so if you don't want that, you will have to turn that header off, turn the debug off on your workbench before you publish it to get that out of there. So for the sake of debugging all logs on FME Flow, that's a bigger answer, and I won't go into that. But if you're more curious about that, please file an issue or a ticket with us, and we'll follow up on you. There are ways of turning more debugging on your server box, but I'm not sure I would recommend that unless you're really trying to just do debugging. All right.
Awesome. Thank you, Steve. Okay. So with that, I will wrap us up here and just say a huge thank you to our team for preparing the answers to all these questions here today. We really appreciate your time and preparing the content. And to Steve and also Sienna, who I saw popped on here in the questions, for your support with Q&A. We really appreciate it. Thank you everyone in the audience for taking the time out of your days to join us today. We hope you gained a lot of value from the content shared. And if you do have a moment to fill out our webinar survey, we really appreciate any feedback. Thanks everyone, and hope you'll have a great rest of your day. Bye for now.